Christof Koch, thanks for joining me on my Substack.
Thank you for having me, Philip.
So, for those of you don't know out there, I'm sure most people do, Christof is hugely influential scientist and consciousness. I think one of the crucial figures in the kind of resurgence of interest in the science of consciousness in the 1990s, together with Francis Crick. Christof was very important in urging the scientific community for this very important task of seeking out the neural correlates of consciousness and continues to be influential in that to this day. But what I wanted to talk about today, actually, is something a little bit different. The last time I saw Christof was at a conference based in Sweden that was aimed at bringing together philosophers like myself working on panpsychism and scientists working on integrated information theory. Christof is an important advocate of integrated information theory. This I unfortunately couldn't go in person due to an injury, but I zoomed in. And then when it got to Christof's talk, I was excited to hear. I assumed it would be maybe on the neuroscience of consciousness, or maybe whether integrated information theory is a form of panpsychism or not. But in fact, Christof, you talked in very vivid, inspiring terms about a mystical experience, if I could put it that way, that you had quite recently that has had a big impact on you. So, I was hoping we could start by just asking you if you could share with me and the viewers something about that experience and what it meant to you.
Sure, I can do that to a certain extent. So first of all, what do I mean? I mean, different people mean different things by mystical experience. Some people call these a type or class of experiences non-dual experience because this distinction between object and subject, between knower and knowing, between apprehender and apprehended disappears. And they're marked typically by loss of self. So your self-consciousness, knowing that I'm Christoph, having that voice in the head, all that disappears, even knowing that where you are, that you have a body, all of that disappears. So there's no more conscious sensation or conscious awareness of being me, of having a body. Um, and that they can be transformative in the sense that they can profoundly influence the person who's had this experience until the rest of their days. The best things written on it, I think, is by William James in his 1902 book, I think, The Varieties of Religious Experiences. And they stay with you. They really stay with you. There's a distinct before and a distinct after. So in my case, I was sitting on a beach after midnight on the southern sky, and I had this experience, and it takes you away. You totally lose the awareness of everything or anything that's around you, and whatever remains of my conscious mind sort of felt like it became identical to the universe at large, uh, and you encounter what Huxley describes as mind at large. Aldous Huxley in the foundation book of The Age of Aquarius, The Doors of Perception, you encounter mind at large, where you well, when I say you, it's inadequate language that I use. Whatever remains of me, of Christoph, this conscious entity becomes one with what appears to be the universal mind and accesses everything, becomes identical to everything. In fact, the title of my last book um, here is Then I Am Myself the Book, and Then I Am Myself the World, which is in fact taken, it's a direct translation from the German Selbst dann bin ich die Welt. It's the second act of Tristan and Isolde by Richard Wagner, where they do have a mystical experience, where suddenly Tristan and Isolde become one and become identical to the world at large. And that's exactly how this experience felt. It's profoundly transformational. It totally left me discombobulated. You have no idea what just happened. It feels like this earthquake shakes the, your ontology. You have these, the plates of your ontology are shifted, which at my age, this was 2 years ago when I was 67, doesn't really, or 3 years ago, doesn't really happen that often anymore, because at this age, you're pretty well established what you believe exists and what doesn't exist. So, and it's a short, it's typically, as William James said already, it's very short. It's unbidden. It happens suddenly. It's involuntarily. It's very difficult to replicate, to have a second such experience. But as he also emphasized, you bring back this ineffable noetic, he uses this Greek term, this noetic quality, and it has this very powerful authority over you, where you simply can't deny that this is what I have experienced. And sure, there was a brain underlying it. And of course, the brain was in a particular state. There's no question about that. But the authority is that I access pure mind. And what I bring back from this is the realization, oh my God, everything is mental. Everything fundamentally is just is consciousness. I know it sounds terrible, woo-woo, but there you have it.
That's absolutely fascinating and very, very vividly described. I'm glad you bring up James. I absolutely love William James. He's one of my all-time heroes. I sorry, when you read James, it's like you're reading a contemporary writer somehow. He
Yep,
seems sort of very fresh and
yep.
such a wonderful, inspiring, insightful thinker. And I agree. Also, we can maybe get onto this that it's still a good place to start. His reflections on mystical experiences, how he characterizes them, the philosophical tools he brings to that. But yeah, let's stay with you for a moment. So do you think has it really fundamentally changed you? Is there a different Christoph before and after this fantastic experience?
Yes, I am in this perennial state of much more. I mean, you bring back this ebullient feeling because almost always this experience leaves you profoundly with this positive ebullient mood where you have this realization, whatever it may be, and it just you're always you're always sort of on this high. I mean, being slightly hypomaniac, if you want, as a clinical
Wow.
condition. But this is lasting now almost 3 years, where you just come back with a very different attitude to life and of all of it. You know, uh, even the way you deal with the conditions, particularly in my country right now here in the US, it just it you just meet those things with a much different attitude. So in that sense, just from your basic emotional settings, it has a profound attitude, no matter the interpretation, no matter what knowledge you take from it. You just feel ebullient. I realize everything is mind. Ultimately, I will return to mind. That this mind is, is may not be very complicated. It may be as a colleague of yours, the philosopher Bernardo Castro emphasized, may be very, very primitive, maybe very, instinctual, like a la Schopenhauer. The will. He calls it the will, this undifferentiated will. But that's what we will out. That's where I came from, and that's where ultimately I will return to. And this realization just colors everything I think, do, or say.
So it sounds like you're a happier person. Maybe I got a sense there, maybe less fear of death, um, with this idea that you're returning to the oneness in everything. Do you think it's made you a better person, sort of morally? Not that you were a evil person before. Well, I don't know. Not that I know of. Has it improved you morally? Do you think?
It's a good question. I don't know whether it's changed me morally. I mean,
So
it's a question worthwhile asking. I don't know. I haven't over the last 2 years, I've not been called upon to, I haven't come to a decision point where I really have to make
right,
a decisive moral judgment about some matter that is
right.
relevant to me. I don't know. It's a good question. It may, I suspect it would.
So how is this connected up with people around you? Have you had any sort of negative reaction from the scientific community? Anyone think you're sort of getting into hippie shit now or something? Or has this been warmly received?
Well, some people are sort of more skeptical, and although they don't say it, these days people are certainly much more open to these possibilities than they were, let's say, 20 or 30 years ago. Um, some people roll their eyes, which is perfectly fine. I mean, I would have done this until recently. Um, People are more tolerant because also we now know, for instance, near-death experiences. So I would submit that near-death experiences are related to, and there's some overlap. They're not identical to, but they're related to um, mystical experiences, psychedelic experiences. Some peak psychedelic experiences are also related to mystical experiences, aesthetic experiences. When I now give public talks about it, I routinely ask people, how many of you, raise your hands? And of course, this is a selection bias. It's a selected audience that goes to my talks, but typically 10, 15% have had such experiences. Some are religious, some are associated with sort of near death or other, you know, uh, medical emergencies. Some are psychedelic. So it's more common than at least I used to think, and our culture doesn't really have a place to put them, to talk about them. At best, certainly when I grew up, the only place you could read about them was in the back parts of bookstores on esoterica, witchcraft, magic, near-death experiences, right? It was sort of considered completely far out, crazy, you know, and no one, and certainly I didn't take him very seriously. But then you read, for instance, I mean, I did this already 25 years ago, that near-death experiences are actually relatively common, that 10% of people who have an in-hospital cardiac arrest have them. That's remarkable. They are almost always, well, the ones that are surface, the ones that are described about, always have this very positive effect on the people who have these near-death experiences. Of course, not all near-death experiences have this beneficial nature. Some are highly adversive. As you might imagine, right? You just have a heart attack inside the hospital. You feel you are dying, and you literally are dying. So you could imagine that people get massive PTSD from that. But in fact, some subset of people also have these extraordinary experiences. Um, so people are much more open to them today. Although scientists ultimately say, okay, it's just your brain, finally. You did something to your brain, and the brain is in a particular state. And I, of course, admit that's entirely a possibility, that it is a product of the substrate. Except that I bring then this authority with me. I've had this experience. So I feel a little bit, there is Frank Jackson's Mary the Color Scientist,
Mary.
right? So the thought experiment in the theory, this knowledge argument. So you have this person who grows up, her evil parents put Mary in a black and white environment. She never sees any color. She doesn't experience color, but she knows she's a scientist of the 23rd century. So she knows everything there is to know about color and the physiology of color and what happens when a photon of a particular wavelength strikes your retina, excites cones, goes up to the LGN, to visual cortex, etc. All this happens, so she understands all of that. Yet she's never seen color. So suddenly now as an adult, she opens the door and she steps into the world, which is of course full of color. She looks at red. Does she learn something new? And in my experience, I would say, yes, I've had this experience. It's like all of you guys are colorblind. I've seen color for 10 minutes. Okay, and now I fall back into this world that is black and white. So you can say, oh, you were just hallucinating. Your brain
Right.
was just, your brain just had had a senior moment, and there's nothing to it. Move on, nothing to see here. But then you're left with the fact, no, I have seen color, and I somehow have to explain it. I'm still a
Mm.
scientist, still a rational person. So now, what do I do as a person who likes to think? Because you can't have two views about the universe. You can't have this private view of idealism, and then everything else around you is physicalist as a scientist. So you try to integrate the two. And then you come upon, so there are two major challenges to physicalism, and I know I'm I'm speaking into the choir, Philip, so forgive me for the sake of the audience. There are two big challenges to standard materialism, aka physicalism. Right? One is um, consciousness, right? Consciousness, the existence of consciousness of any subjective feelings, not just mystical experience, just a feeling. Seeing this magenta phone or having toothache remains unexplained, and the standard response of sort of Dan Dennett, if we take him as a classical exponent of American philosophy, to call it an illusion, to either deny that exists or that to belittle its existence, to deny it any causal power, to gaslighting into believing as well. There's nothing like what it is to be in a state of pain. That's just illusion. What there is behavior associated with pain. You moan, you rub your cheek, you avoid eating on that side of the mouth, but that god awfulness of toothache actually doesn't exist. Try to cancel consciousness. Well, that hasn't worked. Obviously, it hasn't worked because you still have your conscious feelings. So that's number one. Number two, it turns out, of course, that physicalists have great difficulty defining actually what is the physical, right? Particularly with the advent of, this used to be easy, and good old Cartesian materialism, res extensa, everything that has extension, classical physics, everything has a position and a well-defined momentum, and that's what truly exists. But then the advent of quantum mechanics, it made it much more difficult. In particular, the two things that makes it very challenging is that Schrödinger's cat systems can exist in a superposition of state. Well, I don't experience that. How can that be? And now furthermore with entanglement, right, this thing that Einstein always objected against and called it spooky action at a distance, that two particles, can be entangled, can be half a universe away. As soon as you measure or interact with one of them, its wave function collapses. Let's say it's spin up, and then instantaneously, if this is an entangled system, the other particle can be a light year away. Instantaneous, it acquires a state of spin down. How can this be? And this is certainly not my grandfather's physicalism, right? This sounds woo-woo because now I have this spooky action at a distance. It doesn't violate special relativity, we know that, but still, it sounds very, very spooky. So we can't explain consciousness. We don't know really what the physical is, and then you're confronted with such a powerful experience. So now the challenge is, can you put that into a new form, into a new view, or maybe it's an old view of trying to understand the universe? So in fact, I recently organized a conference, a workshop together with the philosopher Bernardo Kastrup, the idealist, Dutch philosopher and computer scientist, called Beyond Physicalism in Switzerland 2 months ago, in the Swiss Alps, bringing together physicists in foundational quantum mechanics and people who are interested in consciousness, particularly integrated information theory, to try to see, because isn't it remarkable that foundational quantum mechanics, they now have this thing called quantum information theory, where they try to explain everything in terms of information theoretical formalism, as of course does integrated information theory of consciousness. And maybe there's a common bridge that we can build that would explain some of this phenomena. Now, of course, integrated information theory still has a substrate. It's not an idealist theory. I would say it's adjacent, but it definitely has a substrate. The substrate is necessary for any conscious experience to exist.
Oh, it's fascinating. So many different ways we could go here. Firstly, I think you're totally right. There has been a cultural shift that people are more open to this. One example in my own case, I recently wrote this book arguing for cosmic purpose. And, 11 years previously, the great Thomas Nagel had written a book arguing for something similar. And I think my experience, I got he got a very, very aggressive
Yes.
reception, very hostile. And I think I didn't get that. Not because I'm a better philosopher. I just think I'm not. I'm a worse philosopher than Nagel. But it's just the
Times
greater
have changed.
openness. I
Yes,
got a 5-star review in Popular Science magazine. I mean, they didn't agree with me, but they, took the ideas seriously. But yeah, okay, so what we've touched on a lot of different things. I want to get to the mind-body problem and panpsychism and physicalism, but let's just stay a little bit longer on the skeptic, right? Let me play devil's advocate, right? As you
sure.
know, I'm probably, so what if I say, look, come on. Okay, you had this experience. It's a very interesting experience, but ultimately it's just caused by electrochemical signaling in your brain. Now, you make the comparison to Mary learning what it's like to see red for the first time. So suppose I say, okay, sure, you can learn about this wonderful new form of conscious experience that's very rare. Like Mary, sees red for the first time and learns something new about the character of a red experience she didn't know about. So now you, Christoph, have this enjoy this mystical consciousness that's quite rare and a wonderful, interesting form of consciousness. Still, right? It's just in your brain, right? How can this possibly give you insights into the ultimate nature of reality, into all things being conscious, you said? I mean, how could just something going on in your head possibly give you those insights?
Well, at that point, of course, the argument is I don't tap just into my own consciousness, but then, or rather, my own consciousness becomes submerged in the larger form of consciousness. I agree, it's a major intellectual puzzle, which is why I'm trying to, now interact with physicists and other people who have problems that maybe sound very different, but may ultimately all be related, bringing, namely, emphasizing the key role of the observer and the fact that there may not be a universe without such an observer, and what does it mean? And how can that be explained within the classical framework, which is my consciousness is uniquely associated with my brain, and so any experience is just tells me something about my brain. And my brain was in a particular state that gave rise to this particular experience rather than to the experience of being bored or eating ice cold pizza, which doesn't teach us anything fundamentally radical new. I agree, it's a challenge. And your explanation is perfectly compatible with physicalism, except your explanation doesn't account for my experience, my unique experience, and it will not allow me to deal with this authority that it has over me. I became whatever remained of me did become part of the entire universe. I want to explain that. I need to explain that because that's the nature of the experience I had. And it's totally acceptable for you to say, yeah, you're just deluded. You're just, in some sense, you're deluded. We accept, I mean, I've had this argument. I accept your experience. It was what it was, but ultimately it's still generated by your brain. And I accept that's a
Yeah.
possibility. Except then, as I hang out with physicists, they tell me, well, we don't really know what the physical is, and we don't really, it's not even clear whether we can speak of a universe that has a state without there being an observer to observe that state. Well, that also sounds pretty woo-woo to me, and certainly very different from sort of classical materialism.
Yeah, that's very fascinating. So yeah, I mean, just to be clear, I was playing devil's advocate there
I
rather than,
understand. I
and it's
understand.
it's interesting the way you connect it to how it's changed you as well. Judge them by their fruits. Um, but yeah, so we'll
I mean, that's the
coming back
most
to
remarkable
yeah,
thing about these experiences, right? One has to say that people report, even in particular with near-death experiences, which, as I've argued, are similar. 10 or 20 years later, people still talk about them like they had them yesterday. They're still as vivid
yeah.
as they were. And very often they do lead to a transformation in the person's. I
Mm.
mean, the classical is and the one that William James talks about is religion conversion experiences, right? Where people now suddenly have a come to Jesus moment, and it fundamentally changes everything they do, including the way they talk, the way they interact, their profession, who they hang out with, etc. So we know it does have this powerful effect on behavior. And we know behavior is very difficult to change, right? We all try to eat less or drink less or, don't look at our phone as obsessively, and we know it's difficult. So here you have one single event that can profoundly change your behavior. So that's quite remarkable. Even just within a standard physicalist view, what is it about these events that can cause this dramatic shift?
Mm. Yeah. So coming back to James, most of his chapter on mysticism, mystical experiences is a psychological study, but at the end he asks a question which is getting close to what we're talking about now. Would it be rational to trust these experiences? As you say, he says they have a noetic feel, a noetic quality. They seem to be not just experiences, but ways of knowing, insights into the ultimate nature of reality in some sense. So is it rational for a mystic to trust what his or her experience seems to be telling them? And he gives a really interesting answer, right? He says, well, if you say no, then you may be guilty of a sort of double standard, because we all think it's okay to trust your ordinary sensory experiences. There's a table in front of me right now, but they could be delusions. We could be in the matrix. It could all be a dream, but we think it's okay to trust your ordinary empirical experiences. We couldn't do science without that. So if it's okay for us to trust our ordinary sensory experiences, why is it not rational for a mystic to trust their experience? So I'm wondering what you think of that. But just before I hand back to you, so I've been thinking a lot about this recently, and one thing maybe James doesn't take into account is, well, the question of how well it fits with your worldview. So, for example, it's a familiar point in Bayesian reasoning, right? That you've got to take into account two things. You've got to take into account the strength of the evidence on the one hand, but also
Your
what
priors.
we call the prior probability, roughly how well it fits with your view about the world more generally. So, if someone says, I've had a cheese sandwich for lunch, you're not going to want much evidence. But if someone says, I just flew in on a dragon, you know, you're going to want a lot of evidence there because it's going to start off with a very low prior. So here's what I've been thinking, Christoph, and I'd like to know, maybe I'll write something on this. I'd like to know what you think of it. Maybe whether it's rational to trust a mystical experience or not depends on your worldview, depends on whether you're a physicalist or a panpsychist, right? So if you're a physicalist, then probably you got to think it's a delusion because consciousness is just in the brain. It's just representing what it's evolved to represent for survival. Uh, but if you're a panpsychist, and you already, you think you're aware of your consciousness and you think ultimate reality is made of consciousness, maybe we bring in, as you've done yourself there, a bit of quantum entanglement. It starts to look pretty close already to what a mystic seems to be experiencing. So what do you think of that? Do you think maybe, yeah, it's rational to think to trust mystic experiences if you're already a panpsychist or an idealist or something, but if you're a physicalist, you should say no, no, no. So it depends on your prior view of consciousness. What do you think?
I'm sure, just like any other experiences, it depends on set and settings. But of course, this experience can also fundamentally turn you from a physicalist into a panpsychist or into an
Yeah.
idealist. So in my case, so I've studied consciousness. I've always believed consciousness exists and is different from the underlying or the associated physical substrate. But then after this experience, I'm now sort of much more idealist. So it was sort of an abrupt change. It wasn't a smooth, continuous change in my priors. I never took idealism seriously. I read Schopenhauer as a teenager, but never took it really seriously. And then suddenly, now my prior for idealism is huge.
Right.
So how is that compatible with the Bayesian view? I don't know, but it's certainly true depending on how receptive to this type of experience. It may well be that the same person who has this experience but has a different prior may well interpret it very differently. There's no question about it. I mean, these are subtle matters. Um, James, of course, was also writing at the end of the age of materialism, before the advent of quantum mechanics, right? when he wrote this book, 1902, I believe. That was before quantum mechanics, of course, came to the scene. And quantum mechanics makes things much more difficult to explain in terms of what actually is the physical, what is actually this thing we call matter or an energy, right? We don't have a theory. Now, some philosophers say, well, an ultimate theory of physics will explain it, but that's a promissory note. That's just saying, yes, sure, I'll be raptured at some point. God will come and will rapture me. That's a promissory note. I can't really do much with that. And for all I know, a future theory of consciousness, maybe it's going to be like IIT, where consciousness is going to be part of this future theory. So right now, yeah, that's what I have to say. It is possible that, in fact, it's quite likely that depending on your priors, you will interpret these things differently. But your priors can, I think, fundamentally change due to this one experience.
Yeah, or maybe that speaks to the sheer strength of the experience. As you say,
Yes.
many people, even after the experience, say it was more real than my ordinary experiences. So maybe if you do have a what we need to do is get my friend Keith Frankish to have a mystical experience, because he adopts this radical illusionist position that consciousness, at least understood as something irreducibly subjective, doesn't really exist. So I wonder if he had a mystical experience, how would it change him? But yeah, I guess I'll have to ask him. But so I'm interested in this connection to near death experiences, though. That we're going back to the start of the conversation. So you see a continuity, I think you said, with mystical and near death experiences. Is the idea that the near death experience is an experience of sort of returning to universal consciousness or something? Is that how you're thinking of this?
So several years prior, in the first week of the pandemic, I had a near-death experience, and
Oh,
I mean, it's different from and similar to. It certainly overlaps. So in my case, there was no conscious sensation of self. There's complete loss of self, complete loss of the environment. And you can have very intense, either your life flashes back to you, or you encountered loved ones that are dead. In my case, it was just terror. There was just this bright light, the light at the end of the tunnel, and terror and ecstasy. So that sense, and people have compared the reports of people with near-death experiences with mystical experiences under high-dose psychedelics. There's a study out of Belgium that's done that. They're really very, very similar. You may want to interview someone called, he's a famous American journalist, Sebastian Younger. He's a war correspondent. He's written a book, Perfect Storm, and then several well-received books about embedding himself with soldiers in Afghanistan. And he's written, his last book came out last year, My Time of Dying, where where he had a near-death experience, and he grew up in a his father was a physicist. He grew up in a total materialistic, atheistic environment, but he encountered his dead father at the time during his near-death experience, and it profoundly changed him. And he's written this book to try to deal with this sort of this clash between his regular view and now his experience, and that's common among near-death experience. And the other thing we mentioned before is this loss of fear of death is part of a near-death experience. It's quite remarkable.
mm. That's fascinating. I didn't know you'd had a near death experience as well. I suppose it's just it's something we're only able to know about recently. Now we've been able to resuscitate people who've come very, very close to death, and it's learn
Well,
about these possibly
Well,
insightful
we've always
experiences.
known about them. I mean, the literature, you can go back all the way to the Greeks, right? The literature is full of accounts where people near drowning, or typically, of course, on the battlefield. I think these
Mm.
cases typically happen under anoxia, when the brain becomes extremely anoxic, like when you're dying, like during a cardiac arrest. Um, when you can have the experience, they were just not taken seriously. As I said, they were always
Right,
consigned, oh,
right.
this is totally woo-woo, this is esoteric, this is crazy. But then you noticed, people, Grayson noticed in the 70s, 80s, and 90s that there's a lot of regularity to these patterns. That very different people, whether you're atheist or not, by the way, doesn't really make much of a difference. Even non-complete as a journalist, I just mentioned complete atheists can have near-death experiences that leaves them transformed and saying, well, yeah, there is this unexplainable thing that classical materialism, physicalism simply cannot is
Right,
unable to explain.
right.
So it leaves you, and what's core from a phenomenological point of view always seems to be the loss of self. This, of
Mm.
course, is also what Aldous Huxley talks about, right, in his Doors of Perception. He calls it what is it, the brain valve, that you need to lose yourself, and then this he has called it the valve, right? So your brain normally restricts access to consciousness. Bernardo Costa would say usually we're in this dissociated state where I don't access your consciousness and you don't access my consciousness, but once in this special state, whatever it is, whether it's anoxia or whatever, the brain now it sort of quiets down, and suddenly you can access sort of this universal form of the mind at
Mm.
large.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Okay,
So
so
can you
I've got a
reproduce
question.
this empirically using
Mm.
technology, for instance? I'm a scientist, so if it's true, can you routinely access this? Is this good for you to routinely access this? Is there a medical procedure or device that I can build that allows you to access this? There are all sorts of interesting questions one can ask as, a 21st century person.
It's the start of exciting times, isn't it? Can I ask
Yes.
you, seeing as you're a neuroscientist, on the topic of near-death experience, one thing that I'm always stuck thinking about is how do people thinking about how memories are stored in these situations? So, I mean, a lot of people want to make the case, okay, near-death experiences maybe show consciousness can survive the brain death because there's very little brain activity. And, some people even want to say you can sort of go outside the body and find things out. Maybe you don't want to go that far. But then if people come back with memories of it, how do you have memories without a brain? I mean, I'm okay. It's one thing to say consciousness without a brain, but memories without a brain. Even Rene Descartes didn't think you could have memories without a brain. So it's always just I haven't got a view about this. It's just always just puzzled me.
Well, I'm personally very skeptical about this brain dead, the brain dead hypothesis, the idea that your brain is actually dead and you still have experiences. Um, for practical reasons. So in a near-death experience, typically what happens, you have this experience. Okay, two things happen. First of all, you have a cardiac arrest. Okay, you're in the hospital, it's very hectic, there's all this stuff going on, cold blue, people, try to resurrect you. You get sedated, you wake up 3 hours later, and you report you had this near-death experience, okay? So now the question is, how do you align the exact time, right? So how do you know you had this experience, but you don't know exactly at what point in time you had it, right? And then a doctor says, well, your brain was, you flatline. Well, so typically, in order to really know that your brain flatline, you have to have a proper EG montage that almost never, ever happens certainly not in an emergency room setting,
Right.
right? You may have two electrodes here. So it's very difficult to infer, plus you have all these motion artifacts. Furthermore, it's very difficult to be really certain that deeper structure like the hippocampus, which are exactly necessary for storage of memory, are really also flatline because our EG typically will not go there. So I'm very skeptical about that claim. And yes,
I
as you
see.
point out, the brain has to be sufficiently functioning for the brain to put down memory traces. So let's say you did access a universal mind, right? You did become one with the universe, and still there has to be changes in the underlying physical substrate for you to recall that experience. But I think that's compatible. And I would predict if your brain if you have some procedure where you can truly turn off the brain, so it's totally flat, then you may have had this experience, but you would not be able to recall it because it wouldn't leave any physical substrate.
Yeah, I think it's very important to point out, isn't it, that when people say they take near-death experiences seriously, that might mean lots of different things. It might mean you think that the mind can leave the body and, notice what's going on in another part of the hospital or something. Or it might mean you think consciousness can survive brain death, or it might just mean there's some very special form of consciousness towards the end of the biological life.
Well, no, no. My interpretation, one interpretation is that you do access that ultimately everything is mental, idealism, okay, which I know you don't
Right,
defend, but let's just stick with it for a moment, that ultimately you became one, you access or you become identical to or become a tiny part of this universal consciousness uh, for for some timeless moment, and then something changes in the underlying brain, right? The doctors revive you, and then your normal egoic consciousness, and you collapse back into this sort of much smaller form of egoic consciousness. That would be
right.
one interpretation. But now you access this universal, and this is what you bring back, and this is what makes you so brilliant and so positive. And so now you can say, yeah, I'm gonna die, but that's okay, because
Right,
ultimately I
right.
will return to this state. Not with There's no belief in idealism, of course, that Christof will survive, that my memories and my traits and my peculiarities will survive, but there is something uh, after death, as it were.
And so you would say you don't fear death?
No, in fact, this happened already earlier following my near-death experience. I realized like 6 and 8. So you think about these experience every day because it's so salient. And then I realized, as you get older, you may not have this yet, but I did. As you start getting older, you sleep less well, and then you lie awake at night trying to think about death and what death really means and how long it is, and you get this existential vertigo, right? It's just like looking down at a
Mm.
cliff and there's no bottom to it. And it's a very uncomfortable feeling, and it's totally useless, but you can't help yourself. I've never had this experience. So this happened like 6 years ago, right at the beginning of the pandemic. Never had a thought about since then. And I don't want to die. I don't have a desire to die, but I just don't think about it. It's just part of my life, and my life is going to end. My egoic Christoph life, Christoph will end. Christoph is finite, and that's perfectly fine.
Oh, it's great you're able to share these things. Well, I'm a little bit younger than you, but I do lie awake at night, sometimes thinking about death. Actually, one of the ways I try to get back to sleep is there's two long poems I know off by heart. One is The Night Before Christmas, the story about Santa Claus. The other is Philip Larkin's long poem about death and how pointless everything is because we die. So I sort of say them to myself, and
Well, you'd say Philip Luck. Well, that's not very helpful. Is that really
not to
helpful?
be here, not to be here, not to be anywhere, and soon nothing more terrible, nothing more true. Anyway, I
And
could
this
say the whole
helps
of it,
you
but it.
fall asleep?
Well, just because it's, I suppose, repetition and no, yeah, I wake up like 90 minutes, 2 hours every night actually, and I used to kind of really bother me. So, but now I just go to bed earlier and spend that time meditating and reading, and it's sort of worked out all right now. Uh, but let's come to the philosophy of consciousness. So you've talked a few times about how this has led you to idealism, and it's absolutely fascinating that you've had this change in philosophical viewpoint, radical philosophical viewpoint from this experience. But let's come back to, so you say I don't accept idealism. So I mean, here's what I think about Bernardo's view. I think Bernardo is a really interesting thinker, and I really love his got a very cool view. I'm not sure why it's different to panpsychism. So Bernardo is very passionate that it's importantly different, and but when he talks about panpsychism, he tends to talk about sort of micro psychism, the little conscious particles. And to be fair, when I and others are talking about panpsychism, we'll often start off there because it's maybe easy to explain. But as we've already discussed, many many theoretical physicists, forget mystical experiences, forget consciousness. Many theoretical physicists are inclined to think our universe isn't made up of little billiard ball particles, it's made up of universe-wide fields and particles as local excitations in fields. If you combine that view with panpsychism, you get to what's sometimes called cosmopsychism, that the universe itself is the fundamental conscious thing. These fields, these universe-wide fields, are the fundamental forms of consciousness. So, is that view different to what you mean by idealism, the view you're now attracted to?
Well, I mean, it's not a theory; it's a view. So I guess yes, I've recently understood after reading Hedda's Markle book that cosmopsychism is what some people used to call idealism. Um, I guess idealism would say ultimately there's only one. Everything arises ultimately out of mentalness, only one. Versus at least my interpretation of panpsychism, I've sort of advocated for for theoretical and biological reasons for some version of panpsychism for a long time, is that I'm conscious, my dog is conscious, the bacteria is conscious, maybe even individual particles in some very, very primitive sense, but they all have their own consciousness. But idealism would say, at least my view of Schopenhauer's type of, or Bernardo's analytical idealism would say, ultimately, all of them are manifestation of a single source
Right.
of consciousness. Call it the will, call it the mind of God or cosmic consciousness, whatever you want. So are they truly different? I don't know. These are we are monkey, as Bernardo says. We're apes, and apes may not have access to ultimate explanations. We can
Yeah.
but try. And of course, it's also not fully. And this is where I struggle. I I um, I advocate, of course, publicly for integrated information theory of consciousness that is not an idealist. It's sort of a version, I don't know how to call it, monist view, a neutral monism or something. But according to IT, there is a substrate, and consciousness is associated with that particular substrate. And so IT would say, well, my experience, okay, it's an experience, whatever it was, I don't doubt that, but ultimately it's based on the substrate of this one brain. So it did not, in no way can you say it accessed universal consciousness. There is no universal consciousness unless there is a substrate that's universal and
Yes.
reaches all across the universe.
Yeah. So again, there's all sorts of different positions one can take. So that to that extent, yeah, I mean, some people would depart even more radically from the conventional scientific worldview, but what you've just said is at least one way in which you're very much
Yes,
still
yes.
wedded to the more conventional scientific worldview. So, I mean, I guess as we
And
start
one has
to
to, right? And I mean, I think, Philip, you and I are going to agree. One has to, because
sure,
science is just so extraordinarily successful at explaining, this and building quantum computers and mRNA
absolutely.
vaccines. So we all agree with that. So it's a wonderful tool. It's the best tool humanity has invented. So whatever our views have to be compatible with that somehow.
Yeah, I mean, I like Bertrand Russell called it the causal skeleton of the world. That physics, that's the
The
job of physics,
causal,
and it does it very well. The causal skeleton of the world. The physics, the job of physics, as I see it, is capturing the causal structure of reality at the fundamental level. That's what physics is good at. But what we must remember, in my view, is that it all kicked off with Galileo taking consciousness out so we could get going with objective mathematical physics. That was a good move. And I'm not going to tell physicists how to do their job, but maybe there's a bit more going on.
well,
Um,
you should talk. You should talk to some of these physicists now, right? The ones at the foundation of physics, trying to deal with entanglement and
sure.
Howard Wiesmann and all these people. They have these no go theorems about to what extent it is reality dependent or even independent of an observer. And clearly does not appear to be independent of an observer. At least that's what they argue.
Yeah, well, I mean, what you call idealism, I guess what I would call cosmopsychism, I suppose that is the form of panpsychism I'm more attracted to because it helps make sense of mystical experiences that I take very seriously, because it seems to fit better with theoretical physicists. I think what we learn from quantum entanglement is that the whole is prior to the parts, right? At least where you have an entangled system. And also, well, a third thing, actually, I'd like to ask you what you think about this. The third reason I like it is because I take the fine tuning of physics for life very seriously. You know, this recent discovery, at least according to our current theories, that for life to be possible, certain numbers in physics had to fall in an incredibly narrow range. And on the face of it, it looks wildly improbable that you get the right numbers for life just by chance. Now, some people want to postulate a supernatural designer who fixed the numbers to make sure we've got life. But if you've got a conscious universe already, then it's not so much of a step saying, well, maybe it has goals of itself, maybe it fine-tuned itself. Is that a possibility you might be open to, or is that
I
a
guess
step
it's a
too far?
possibility. I
What do you
mean,
think
yeah,
about fine-tuning?
I'm in two mind about it. I mean, on the one hand, yeah, it's sort of, it has to be because we find ourselves here as observers. So clearly the universe has to be capable of supporting, you know, sufficient complexity to have minds. So is this a truism? Is this self-evident? Uh, uh, I'm Yes, I'm not sure about it. Or is it the case that the universe, becoming conscious, self-selects itself, self-tunes itself somehow? Yeah, I don't know what to make of this argument.
On the
It's
first response,
puzzling.
which is a common one, I always like John Leslie's reaction here. John Leslie was one of the early books on the fine tuning issue called Universes, a very interesting book, and he has this firing squad analogy response to that. So you're being about to be executed. Five expert marksmen, very short distance. They all load up and they all miss, and you think, oh god, that was lucky. And they load up and they miss again, and they miss again, and they keep missing, and they miss, and they miss, and they miss. You're going to think something weird going on here, but well, maybe you ought to think, well, if they'd hit me, I wouldn't be around to think about it, so I shouldn't be surprised. Nothing to see here. Of course, you're not going to think that, right? You're going to think this needs explanation. Is there some sort of mock execution? So why is that any different to the fine tuning case? Yeah, it's true that if the universe didn't have the right numbers for life, we wouldn't be around, but still needs explaining, no?
Well, one explanation, of course, they tend to the, thousand universes, and so we find ourselves in the one that's conducive to life, and all the other ones still exist, but nothing is happening there. So, right, that's one
Yeah.
explanation for a sort of multiverse, right? Why you need a multiverse, and of course it's untestable. It's purely metaphysical speculation.
Yeah.
And so
Well,
the
I've
challenge
actually.
for me ultimately, because we need to finish, Philip,
Sure, sure.
is is there the one interesting challenge is, can we, from this experience, can we now combine it maybe with some new physics to think about consciousness and come up with a new explanatory framework that can explain some of these things and then has empirical testable predictions? Because ultimately, I don't just want to be sort of back in the situation, well, okay, it's your belief against my belief, and in 100 years and 1,000 years, we're still going to have this debate, about one ism versus the other ism. Is there a way we can actually make progress by coming up with experiments that will test one of these interpretations?
Sure. Sure. Yeah, well, I'm very excited by that project you've just described. Well, maybe just a final question. I mean, one of your books from a little bit of a while back now had the subtitle "Confessions of a Romantic Reductionist," and I always really appealed to me that title. Sort of, I love the idea of kind of bringing together something of the scientific, something of the spiritual, and trying to mingle them together. What do you think about the can mystical experiences potentially form a kind of reimagining of religion, a way of bringing the secular and the spiritual together? A lot of people talk about that we're in a bit of a meaning crisis at the moment with the decline of religion, and maybe new atheism is a bit passe now. Do you think there's any hope for mystical experiences giving people a sense of meaning and hope, and maybe a new way of engaging with religion and spirituality?
Totally. The universe would be a so much better place. Imagine if Xi and Putin and Trump and all the other dictators, right, that control our lives, if they could all have a mystical experience, if they all become one with the universe for 5 minutes, right? Imagine what that would do to world politics, right? World politics would not be the same. It would be in a very, very different space. Yes. So I think if everyone could have this, that would be a wonderful way of dealing with our conflict. And I think fundamentally religion, at the root. I mean, mystical experience, I think, at the root of our religiosity. Some people who have this and then go forth with this experience, now they try to interpret it given their particular framework at this particular time, and then they convince others who have not had who had not had a mystical experience of the reality of their vision. So I think mystical experience at the root of our tendency to be religious.
When I met Joe Rogan, I said to him that I'm inclined to think we wouldn't have had Brexit in the UK if more people had had psychedelic experiences, and made him laugh. But oh, Christoph, well, it's a very inspiring project you're engaged on. It's impacted me to hear about your life experience, and a kind of experience I've never been lucky enough to have. But it's given me lots to think of and reflect on, and I hope we can continue the conversation.
Happy
Thanks
to.
for the chat.
Happy to. Thanks for having me. Thanks for
Thanks.
having me.